mess up your display. Do you need this or not?
I know. Just go HDMI.
Yep. I need to unfreeze this.
All right, so my name is Mike, and today I'll be talking to you about GraphQL. A little bit about myself. Please don't boo me, but I currently work at Mastery Connect. And I can endorse every single one of the people that went through the massacre. We let it go some really, really solid engineers, and it's very painful sitting with a bunch of empty desks around me. And so I just want to make sure everybody lands at a good place. And so I don't know if you want any references or whatever, all of them are solid. So definitely look at them. In addition to that, I'm just a regular guy. I live in Farmington. I have about an acre of property. I have some goats and some chickens, and I have 4 kids that keep me quite busy when I go home. And so I'm not a guy that goes home and codes all night. I kind of try to be dad when I come home. And then at Mastery Connect, I mostly maintain our integrations with third-party applications, and then I also work on APIs. And it used to be the API team, but now I am the API team. So, and truth be told, I kind of want to start this talk out saying that I don't know what I'm doing half of the time, and I end up going to Google and Stack Overflow and copy and pasting most of the stuff off there and seeing if it works or not. That's gradually gotten better as I've gotten more comfortable coding, but I went to RubyConf about, I think it was 2 years ago, and somebody gave a talk about imposter syndrome. And I was hearing it going around in this group about the amount of time that people have been programming here. And I know that I am not alone in feeling sometimes like I'm an imposter at my job, like I really don't know what I'm doing. And at any moment, somebody's going to find out that I am not supposed to be here and they're going to let go of me, right? And so...
turned off for half a second.
Is that?
The screen share turned off for half a second.
Anyway, call it inducing.
Very good.
And so I really enjoyed this talk. And I talk with some of the most talented engineers that I know, and I know that they either admit to or they put on a pretty strong face when I ask them, but they all have some form of imposter syndrome when they work at places. So when you represent yourself at a job interview or at looking at somewhere to go code, don't doubt yourself. It is so important to believe in yourself and to just move forward because you have unique talents as a person, right? And you're going to be able to just figure it out. And so that's basically all day at work for me. It's just figuring things out as I get faced with challenges. So don't get discouraged. Keep moving forward, especially if you haven't even had a programming job yet. If you've been in QA with slight dev experience, don't be afraid to make that leap into getting a junior programming job somewhere. It can pay off great dividends. So I will be talking about GraphQL versus REST. Recently at Mastery Connect, we were looking for a solution for our mobile team that was needing a whole bunch of data out of our app. We basically kind of started fresh. We're building a whole big mobile app representation of our actual main app. And so we were looking at options, and GraphQL was one of the things that came up. And so we've been playing around with it for about, I don't know, about 6 months, maybe a little less. And so I'm not a wizard at GraphQL, but it's done some really great stuff for us, and I've also noticed some limitations. I'm not here to sell you on something. And also doing a comparison between REST and GraphQL really is improper, and I'll get into more why they don't really compare to each other. But I will describe how we use it at Mastery Connect and how it's been beneficial for us. So before we can kind of go over, I remember when I first started programming, I didn't really know what an API was or even what REST was. So I kind of want to go over the basics of what a RESTful API is.
Your Hangouts thing isn't reflecting on there. So I'm in graphics real quick.
I didn't have anything there. I'm also really happy that this was just the largest meetup group that we've had. And
just for you, Mike. Just for you. I'm going to do your entire screen.
All right, so REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and I'll even kind of describe real basically what an API is. It's somebody has some data, and I want to do something with that data. So it can be within the same company, or it can be two companies talking to each other, and I need a way to extract that data from one place to another. And there's a methodology in which we do that, which is called REST. It's basically a standardized architecture for extracting data from an app. And it's standardized so that people that consume APIs, people that actually tap into it to extract data, they kind of expect what to see and how it works. And it also works in well with just standard basic programming like CRUD, and it does a good job of just manipulating the HTTP verbs and yeah. So REST is simply just an architecture definition on how to retrieve data from a system, and it's basically just how the world of APIs does business. And so GraphQL is not a great option for a public-facing API because not everybody is used to seeing this type of an API out there. And I'll go into a little bit more why it might not be a great option for public-facing. So basically, I just told you a bunch of stuff about REST. This is kind of what it looks like. You have something like a URL, like get some data, and you define what type of data you want and an ID, and then you call whatever format .json or .xml, whatever you want to return, or whatever the app that is feeding you the data allows you to return, and it returns a data object like that. So I retrieve user number 3, their name is Adeline, right? And so it's really not that complex, but sometimes if you just throw the word RESTful API out there, it's a bit more confusing. But now what if we wanted to get some nested data for Adeline, right? So I've built a little demo app that I will be doing some live demos here. And so I basically have a users table, I have a quotes table, and I have a Star Wars table, which is all their favorite Star Wars characters that belong to the user. And then the Star Wars characters can have quotes as well. So users have quotes, users have Star Wars data, and Star Wars data also has quotes nested in it, right? But if now we wanted to return a nested object out of this, we'd expect the API provider to, well, my URL disappeared. I don't know where that went. But basically, add another / that says quotes, and then you can get user 3, and then all the quotes for that user that they have submitted, right? And it will return you an object like, maybe not. Oh yeah, right there. So it would return you an object of quotes, right? And so you're great. Okay, now I have this user with ID 3. I have all their quotes. But what if you wanted to return the objects together? And RESTful really doesn't do a great job at combining these things, and it's not really intended to combine these things either. And so it's really up to the endpoint provider, so the API provider, to say, okay, I could create another endpoint that combines this data together, right? And so, let's see. So the endpoint provider would update their API, and now you would be able to just return user 3, and you'd automatically show the nested quotes that belong to that user. And so, but as you can see, as maybe more nestings happen or something like that, it starts becoming, you start maintaining a whole bunch of different endpoints that, okay, this endpoint gives you a user in quotes, this endpoint gives you just a user, this endpoint gives you just quotes, right? And so wouldn't it be awesome if you said, okay, I don't care about what the endpoint provider or what the endpoint provider wants me to return, but I basically tell the endpoint provider this is the data that I want, and you only return me that data, including nested data. And this is kind of where GraphQL comes into play. So GraphQL, it's a query language, which is why it's different from REST, because REST is more of a architecture methodology, and GraphQL is an actual query language. So basically what that means is you send a standardized format of a query over to the API provider, and the API provider returns, basically executes that query on the server, and then it returns you the data set of just the stuff that you've requested for it. So even back in this example, say I'm I'm just building a simple app where it's a little social network or whatever, where I want to show people that like different Star Wars characters and I want to get percentages off it. So I really don't care about creating that and updating that. But with the set REST API, I'm forced to consume this data no matter what. So there's going to be data transferred to me that I'm just going to throw away. I'm not going to do anything with it, right? And so it's kind of wasteful in that sense. And with GraphQL, I can say, no, I don't want the create and update that field. Just return me this set of attributes on this model, and it only returns that subset of data. And it allows you to go nesting as far as you want to go. So GraphQL was developed, maintained, and it's implemented by Facebook. It went into production, I believe, in 2012, and they've been running their entire mobile world off of GraphQL APIs. The reason they implemented it was around versioning. They were really struggling with all the different versions of the Facebook app that lived out in the world, and they were building different endpoints for all these different versions to maintain all this stuff. And they were looking for a way to combine this into one version, basically, and they created GraphQL to allow them to do this. So I already spoken, lets them return what they want to return. And you do this by sending a post request to the server, and on the post request you put a body with it, and in this body that houses your query object that you tell the server of, hey, I want to return these things, right? And it looks a lot like JSON, and in case you don't know what JSON is, this is a JSON object on the left right here. It looks a lot like JSON, except for the keys are all gone. So you basically say, you just put all the keys and all the values, you don't put colon value or whatever, you just put the keys of the items that you want to retrieve. So it just looks like a weird JSON object without any values in it, basically. And then it takes that and interprets it into a query, and it executes it, and it returns you the results. So here's just a little visual representation of what that would look like. You basically have a single URL, like getsomedata.com/API, and how RESTful would normally say, okay, slash this, slash that, slash that. Here on the left is a representation of what a query would be. So we're going to query for users with ID 1, and we want to return ID, first name, and all those fields, right? And it's going to return an object that is equal to that. But once again, if I don't want to create that or update that, I just simply not send that over to the server, and it wouldn't return me that data. And so I don't have to spend a bunch of time parsing wasteful data and just throwing it all away. Here's kind of a side-by-side comparison of a REST versus a GraphQL client. There really isn't too much to this slide. It just kind of shows how with a REST client, you hit a URL, and it returns you a set data structure in a set standardized format that's determined by the API endpoint provider. And here's the actual user that's determining, hey, this is the data that I want to retrieve. So we can get into a lot of conversations, and I have a lot of pros and cons to GraphQL. And so this is kind of a summarized list of those things. I've already talked about some of them, but once again, GraphQL is not a widely adopted and thus not a great fit for a public-facing API. If you're going to throw a GraphQL API out there, your documentation is just going to have to also teach people how to tap into a data set that they're not used to normally tapping into, right? In addition to that, there needs to be a relationship between the API endpoint provider and the API consumer, because with GraphQL, you can retrieve basically as much nested data as you want. And even though you can put stopgaps in place that says no more than 2 relational objects in a row or whatever, it can quickly get out of hand if you have a table with, like at Mastery Connect, we have some pretty large tables, and if people were just querying nested stuff on there, the API consumer can get very abusive of the amount of data that they're returning in a single call. Where with a RESTful approach, it's generally kind of confined, right? And you use pagination to kind of sculpt that. But you don't really have that benefit. You could implement a slight version of pagination, but it's not quite the same. One cool thing about GraphQL is that it's very maintenance-light, and I will be showing why it's maintenance-light in the code demo that I do. But for right now, just know it's not as heavy maintenance as a traditional RESTful API endpoint is. It does not give optimal performance, and GraphQL is still young enough, and especially the Ruby implementation of GraphQL it's young enough to where I think the Ruby implementation started 2 years ago, and it really kind of started picking up about a year ago. And so Shopify is using it pretty heavily. I don't know if you guys know what Shopify is. They're just a big dev shop. And they've built some tools around GraphQL to make it better because it does not do a good job at eager loading N+1 queries. Let me explain what an N+1 query is. So basically you can have an each loop, right? So 10 users each do print me their name out to the screen, right? Or now what if all those users have comments to the users, right? Or reviews on the users, right? So if you have an each loop that loops through 10 users and you do teacher.comments, it's making a query to the database 10 separate times for each of the users, right? And so an N+1 query is that 10 times tapping the database for retrieving comments for each record independently, instead of sending a lump sum of data over and saying like retrieve me all these records all at once, right? So that's when you hear N+1 query, it's a query being executed more times when it can be lumped or batched together into a single call. And queries can be absolutely monstrous. Some like our mobile team, we're still in a kind of a demo phase with it. We have one school district who's using, they're kind of like our test bunnies on this, and we already have a couple of users that can't use it because what the mobile techs had done was they were basically hitting, you can string queries together. So they strung like 6 different queries in a single API call together all at once. And it was just timing out. It was too much data that they were trying to retrieve, and we hit our 1 minute threshold and we just timed out and said, sorry, server crapped out on you. So once again, there needs to be a relationship between the consumer and the provider, or you need to have some pretty good stop gaps in place to prevent that from happening. And another really cool thing, which is what Facebook is also React. It's very consumable by the view object to actually, so normally kind of if you envision Ruby, retrieve a record from the database, and you get an instance variable that says something equal that you can then represent in the view, right? But in GraphQL, that layer's kind of gone. So basically you just go to the database, you get your data set back, and that data set is actually what you use to populate the view with, right? Because you don't have to retrieve all the records that the database says it has. It says, I have 10 attributes on this thing, but you only want to show 2 of those attributes on the page. You can make a very specific query that says, I only want to return these things, and the view doesn't have to do any parsing or disposing of different data sets, right? So it's kind of cool that way. So let's do a quick demo of how it works. So this is the GraphQL Ruby implementation that I'll be showing. Like I said, I've built a little demo app, and I probably need to share this. You shared the whole screen? What's happening, man? I'm in the Twilight Zone, bro. Wow. It's blowing my mind. Bigger. 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 One more. Happy? Okay, cool. So just because you implement GraphQL doesn't mean it just is going to look at all of your models that you have in your app and it says, okay, to make everything exposable to the user. You still have control over what the users actually have access to. So as you can see here, this is kind of, it's much like a schema object that you're used to seeing when you run a migration or something like that. The schema object, which is the visual representation of the database. And if I were to take a field out of here, that would be a field that the user would no longer have access to tap into, right? So you don't necessarily have to expose everything in here. So once again, I have a quote type. A quote just has an ID, a quote, Star Wars type, a user type.
And then another cool thing about schemas is that you can create virtual fields on them. So I can return a field to a user that's not necessarily a record in the database. Like here I have this lucky number field on user. So this is basically just a calculation of their age and their height, and I just do some random calculations, and I say your lucky number is this, right? That's not an actual field in the database that they're pulling into, but the endpoint user can hit it like it is an attribute on the database that they could just retrieve. So that's kind of a virtual field. Anytime you see a resolve block, that's fair game. Like basically you can do anything Ruby that you want in there. And yeah, it's just, that's kind of where you operate out of. And so this is basically just a schema definition. This is how you define relationships. So you can see user has quotes on it, and quotes, the type is a quote type, which is this type up here, right? So quote type. And it's an array of quotes, so that tells us it's a has many relationship. User has many quotes, right? So this way you could tap into, you could just hit user with ID, whatever, and if you request a quotes object, it's just automatically going to return you all their quotes. So that's how relationships work. You can specify, well, this is a good spot to explain that, but so that's that. So that's what that looks like. Let's first go over a traditional RESTful, right? So this is a very basic controller with a show and an index action, and we're just going to render some stuff. And if you guys have never used Postman before, does anybody know of any good alternatives to Postman? Curl? Man, it's hardcore. I'm not a Vim user, okay? I can't make this any bigger, I apologize. But so this is basically a traditional RESTful, so it says users/1, right? So I'm going to retrieve, where'd you go? Okay, so I'm going to get user/1, right, which is myself in this case. And then here is the traditional for the index action that it hits. This retrieves me all the users from the database, right? So that's a traditional, but like once again, you're limited to whatever this controller tells you you're going to return. Like in this case, I open up the entire model attribute, but if I had a specific subset, it doesn't do nested stuff unless I specify it very, like if I build out a separate endpoint. You don't want to break RESTful and just start throwing in a bunch of nested relationships into show action, because it's not really a show action of a single record, right? Moving on into, so this is kind of where I just have defined my schema object, and this is an actual GraphQL controller. So these fields right here that you see, I consider them mini endpoints. So you always hit a single URL. So my URL for this case is /GraphQL. But within that actual nested query object that I send, that valueless JSON object, you specify a field. So this field says user, where if I go into Postman, show you, that's this right here. That's that relates to that field object in my controller. Whoops. What did I just do? And then in here I say that to retrieve a single user, this bang means it's required. I require an argument of ID to be passed to me. So as you can see in my Postman, I have ID:1, and then I say, okay, I want to retrieve all these records. And all it does in the resolve block, this is just a standard, you can do pretty much anything you want in here. You just do a user.find, and this is the actual record that it retrieves from the database, and then it just goes, it looks at the schema and it says, okay, what fields are available on here? What fields is the user requested? This is the object. Okay, go on and send this back to the user. So if we execute this, and I bring this up, not there. It basically returns me the same thing as the standard RESTful API endpoint, right? So user right here. Now, what if we wanted to retrieve the index action or simulate the index action in GraphQL? Or actually, let's go into nested first. the nested stuff. So here I have the user has many quotes and the user has many Star Wars stuff, and Star Wars has quotes nested under that, right? So for user ID, I want to get all their quotes, and I want to get all their favorite Star Wars stuff, and I want to get all their favorite Star Wars quotes. So what that looks like in here, it's the same user endpoint, mini endpoint that we're hitting, and when we fire that off, it's just going to return me all the nested objects that belong under it. So here's all the quotes that belong to the user. Here's their Star Wars object. The Star Wars has quotes attached to it, all that stuff, right? So pretty cool how we can get nested values out like that. This is simulating the index action. This is field users. And then I basically say this is a user type, but it's going to be multiple of them, so it's an array. And I expect an argument of multiple IDs, or if that multiple IDs is not present, I want either an array of IDs, or I want to retrieve all the users that have paid access. So I have a paid field, which is just a Boolean on user, it's true or false. So I can say paid access, or I can send in the array of IDs, and it's going to return me only those objects. So if we go back up, so here I want to retrieve users with ID 1, 2, and 3, fire it off, and it returns those 3 users back for me. Multiple at once, kind of cool. Here I have a paid access example. So I want to retrieve all the users that have paid access in my app. So paid access equal true. It comes into this resolve block. If args paid access is there, then only retrieve me users where paid access is true, right? And I fire that off, and it just returns all the paid users in my app. There shouldn't be any false in here. So I really don't see anything else. I could go through a couple more endpoints, but that's basically traditional GET request that you would do to an API is what this is. And it's kind of weird because you say a GET request, but you still send a POST request over just because you're sending a body with a query parameter in it. But it's really a traditional GET request, which is why it's got this head denominator of query. This query actually comes into a resolve block down here that says if query, it's a query type, and query type has all these mini endpoints available to it, basically. So now what if we wanted to make a POST request? What if we wanted to update a user or create a new user? You can do that as well. It's called a mutation in GraphQL. So we expect an argument of data, which is this create user type, which is also defined on the schema-like object. And this has a bunch of input fields on it. So it's basically these are the things that you're allowed to send me to now go and create a record in the database. So we can create a user with an ID, all these attributes basically. So this is what a mutation would look like. So you see how the query right here changed into a mutation right there. I know that's really small. I apologize, but it's not going to get bigger. So. And then we have this data object, which is just a hash of all the key value pairs that I want to create in the database. And so this should, and then another cool thing is after you create the record, you can immediately return attributes off that record right back. So it's basically like normally you get a 200 back saying this was successful, you created this record. You can actually now retrieve the record at the same time as you're creating it. It's kind of neat. So we do that. Boom, it just created user 1004 with this data right here. Then, excuse me. Then what an update would look like is you have this, you just basically pass it an ID, and what I do in a controller, right here, so I say if there's an ID that's present, so if the user is passing me ID, we're doing an update, right? We're going to update these records. So user with whatever ID, go ahead and update those attributes and then return it back out. So if I do user with ID 15, set that equal to my data as well, hit send on that. It just updated user with ID 15 to have all that data in there, right? So it kind of shows you partial of the CRUD. You could do a delete or destroy, very much the same by just creating another endpoint in which you have a resolve block in which you delete a record from the database. So that's how you perform CRUD in GraphQL. There's really not that much to it. There was documentation is a bit sparse on it, so it's kind of figure out as we've been going along. But it's been sufficient to where we've been able to make a pretty good product out of it. I am not the brain behind this. There were a lot of people in Mastery Connect who figured out how to do a lot of these things, and I've learned a lot from those people, and they've helped. We've all helped each other down the process of figuring out how this all works. So that's basically how you perform CRUD actions in GraphQL. It's cool. I hope you understand why kind of the difference between REST and GraphQL and when you might want to implement one or the other for an app. And that you also understand some of the limitations behind GraphQL, and hopefully it gets better with time. I know it's very actively being monitored. There's a Ruby, or there's a Slack group called GraphQL. It has a Ruby channel in there. Armo Sogol is the guy that actually created the gem for it. He's very active in here, very quick to respond. So if you ever run into anything, jump into this chat, and everybody's really friendly and willing to help you out. That's it. It's GraphQL. Questions? Go easy on. Yeah.
Hey, thanks very much. I really appreciate the technology. And how we hear this tonight. I've heard from a handful of people that the previous presentation got some problems, a bit challenging. How would you kind of characterize things aside from the details of the here?
Well, from actually implementing it in an actual real-life app with a lot of data behind it, we're figuring out solutions for its inability to properly process queries. And so there are other tools out there that we've started using for that. And then in addition to that, the documentation has really been so sparse that it's been hard to implement it in a real life app because you don't really know what its limitations are, and not enough people are using it really. But thus far we have it up and running, and it's been pretty successful as far as it keeps up, and so but I don't think we would want to make anything public facing out of it where somebody could just badger us and take down our site in no time. So yeah, does that answer your question sufficiently? All right. Any other questions? Up there? Yeah, go.
Yeah, I mentioned this, I missed it, but are you guys using it for mobile, or is there all this kind of
Right now we're not just using it for mobile. Our plan is we're kind of moving towards microservices at Mastery Connect, and so we are looking to internally communicate via GraphQL standard and just pass data back and forth that way. And we also use it we have a couple of other, a company that we bought and one other type company that we integrate with that are on GraphQL or consuming it in some way or another. So sorry, was that your question? Was that sufficient? Yeah, Carlos.
So is that what I showed us kind of similar to your production? Or is this like a quick journey to get it going? Because you probably models or even like having the actual models to get what they need.
I just went through a pretty big refactor of it. This is how it basically looked recently, and I've gone through a pretty refactor where I did a lot of those things and cleaned it up a lot. And yeah, I also wrote unit tests around the whole thing, and it's very testable. It was very friendly in that regard, yeah. So our main app no longer looks like this, basically. Yeah. So.
This is more of a comment. You mentioned initially, like, you don't know if you can really get pagination working, but you know, kind of like better that when you're doing like user where page true limit and or limit, you can do limits and offsets and do per page and page that, right? So is there a reason why it couldn't be pagination, or you just haven't done it yet?
I really haven't thought through the problem. So, and I haven't seen any implementation of pagination anywhere in any of the examples that I've looked at. So I haven't thought through it, but I'm with you. I am doing a limit in there, and so I kind of contradicted myself there. Yeah,
No, it's okay.
right.
The other
But I
one-
do think you could implement it.
The other one you might be able to do is, I mean, if you can do that, you include solvent plus one in a lot of ways too, right? Like, user includes quotes and then call the same thing. Can you get away with that, or is